We come to the 15th presentation in this year of the Parayana series. But this is the second presentation in the second set of 13. When I began to design educational courses in the mid-1960s in San Francisco, the semester was always 13 presentations, which is a quarter of a year. And it was a time-honored form from the time of the Renaissance, when the first universities would have the arts and sciences together. And so I'm old enough to have begun that way, and so I keep that honorary form. It is interesting now because we're getting into deeper water. The first 13 presentations were an introduction of the way in which about 1,000 years ago, a millennia ago, there was an immense change that happened in the European world. The year 1000 was recognized as being the millennial year. And so time forms in terms of ages is so indelible in civilization that especially in the medieval times, one got the sense that there was an apocalyptic panic. And indeed, one of the great books on that whole era and its repercussions was by Norman Cohen, called In Pursuit of the Millennium. And Cohen lived to be 93, and right at the end of his life, after a distinguished career, his last book was about the missing wedge in Western appreciation of civilization, and that was the work of Zarathustra. And as some of you may know, I spent about 10 years making assiduously a translation of Zarathustra's original gathas into not just English and not just American English, but into a 21st century American English poetic, which is now going to be made available through our publishing, Shared Presence Press. One of the sets of books that very early on for me in the late 1950s at the University of Wisconsin were two paper bounds that came out. And at that time, in university bookstores, paperbacks were sorted according to publisher. All of the Anchor paperbacks were together, all of the Dover together, all of the Penguins together, etc. And in one of the shelves, I noticed a book that stuck out, and its title was Answer to Job by Carl Jung, C.G. Jung. And that paper edition had a green spine. I remember holding it in my hand and kind of a blackish cover with some designs on it. And I happened to have enough money to buy a copy. And I tried to read Carl Jung's Answer to Job, and it was just completely beyond me. And about 2-3 years later, when I had put a lot of time in, I had a double major, so I had to go 5 years to the University of Wisconsin. And I began to understand that I could read a little bit of Jung's Answer to Job. I returned to it, and I remember the day that I returned to it, I went down to the University of Wisconsin bookstore, and I found a book in the drama books section called The Book of Job as a Greek Tragedy. And I bought a copy of that paperback. It's still available through Amazon. If you look up the Book of Job is a Greek Tragedy by Horace M. Callan, you will find many editions and copies of it. Unfortunately, not the original paperback. The Book of Job became, for me, at that point, a portal that these two pillars, and I didn't know why at the time that they meant a lot to me, but I can say today, some almost half a century later, that they're extraordinary. The answer to Job is reprinted by Princeton University Press in Princeton took over the publishing from Pantheon Books a long, long time ago, decades ago, the Bollingen series. And the Bollingen series was a series that was made possible by the hundreds of millions of dollars of the Mellon Foundation, Paul and Mary Mellon. And it was interesting because Mary Mellon was psychically active and not as a channeler or anything like that, but she was able to have very, very profound dreams and interests, quite an extraordinary woman. And she applied by courier to Carl Jung in Zurich to become a patient of his, and Jung by that time was world famous. This is in the late 1930s, and he said, I have no place, I have no time, I have no room. And so Paul Mellon, being the inheritor of this huge fortune, took Mary, and they took a hotel in Zurich and also a country house rental in Küsnacht, which is a suburb of Zurich on the lake. And they began to show up almost every day, literally on the doorstep of Carl Jung. And finally, he relented, but he said, part of my fee is not for money. I have plenty of that, but I would like to see a publishing company set up to publish books which are not in print, which will have trouble being in print. And so the Mellons set up the Bollingen Foundation right at the beginnings of the 1940s. And the first volume was published in 1943. And it eventually ran to 100 volumes, as not just individual volumes, but sometimes whole sets. And one of the sets is still being published. It's the Mellon Lectures in Fine Arts. And it must run to 50-some volumes, almost 60 volumes now. So the collected works of Jung, Carl Jung, is volume 20 of that Bollingen series, and there are about 20 volumes, and they update it every so many years. So the excerpt of many important books by him is put out in paper editions. And so the Answer to Job by Carl Jung is one of those. The book, this is the first edition from 1918 of Horace Callan's The Book of Job is a Greek Tragedy. And it was incredibly researched and written. And it is very, very poignant. And putting these two books together, the Book of Job finally is able to be shown to be a portal into a wonderland. Because one has to understand not only what Jung's answer to Job is all about, and what Horace Callan's The Book of Job is a Greek Tragedy is all about, and with Callan and with Jung, one widens that portal to something where you enter into a charismatic, multidimensional wonderland of cosmic proportions. One of the aspects that we're going to talk about today is that no one knows who the book of Job's author is, but I do. And so we're going to talk about the author of the book of Job, who also is one of the great, almost unsung, unheard of, world-class authors. In fact, not just world-class, but cosmic-class authors of our species on this planet. The author was born in Alexandria about, say, 235 BC, was a Jew, but an extremely educated, well-versed Jew, not a rabbinic Jew. There was no rabbinic Judaism at that time at all. And the old Judaism, the Torah holding based Judaism, which was always under criticism by the prophets. All of the prophetic works, the 12 great prophets, are critical of those who hold to the Torah as being the metronome, the index, the judgment base of how then Judaism is to be understood. And all of this is a sideshow that can be understood and has been understood by many persons of genius, and especially in Alexandria at that time, and in the United States at our time, starting in the 1940s and going up to date. One of the most powerful sets in the Bollingen series is 13 volumes. And those 13 volumes are entitled, overall, Hellenistic Judaism in its heyday, the symbols and everything. E.R. Goodenough, Goudnough, was a professor at Yale. And his symbols in Hellenistic Judaism was a revival of the understanding that Hellenistic Judaism, centered in Alexandria, was so powerful at the time that it wasn't just about Judaism, but broadcast through the immense dynamic, the power, the intelligence, the brilliance of the city of Alexandria. And by the time of about 235 BC, when our author was born, it had been about 40 years since the great Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who was in charge from his father, Ptolemy I, usually referred to as Soter, Savior. And the original Ptolemy, of course, was a lifelong friend of Alexander the Great. He's about 10 years older than Alexander. And when Alexander's father, King Philip II, decided that at about 12 years old that he would have his son, Alexander, tutored by the best available person, he found Aristotle and brought Aristotle from his Lyceum in Athens to Macedonia in the north and had him become the private tutor, not just of Alexander, but of several companions of his. And one of the 5 companions was the older Ptolemy, and Ptolemy, being a little older, was old enough already to be a military man, so that he became sort of like the upperclassman overseer of the Aristotelian tutoring of Alexander the Great and his 4 other companions. One of them was named Nearchus, and Nearchus became the admiral of Alexander the Great's navy, and several others who did not turn out so well. But it was Ptolemy who was always like the older friend, the older companion, as it were, always watching out from behind the scenes, always taking a very broad look. And because he was tutored by Alexander's favorite person, Aristotle, Ptolemy was quite educated. So after Alexander died and his empire was split among warring factions and kingdoms, Ptolemy carved out for himself not only Egypt, because of Egypt being ancient, wealthy, traditional, but because it was the site of the unbuilt yet Alexandria. It was Ptolemy who built Alexandria, who put it into architectural engineering practice, and who understood from Aristotle, from Alexander the Great, from himself, that the center of Alexandria was not the armory. It was not the palaces located in a peninsula called Lochias in Alexandria. It was the library. And powering as the pivot of the great library of Alexandria was the Museion in Greek. In Latin, it's called museum. The Museion is the temple of the muses, 9 women as a set. And the set of the 9 muses only becomes a harmonic when the 10th is added to them. The 10th is not just the addition of all of them together as a set, but it's the inclusion of Apollo, because Apollo and the 9 muses together make a perfect 10. And it is this archetypal perfect 10, a masculine sun divinity whose chariot is the sun going over the sky, whose sibling is Artemis, the huntress, Diana in Latin, who is the virgin who understands the whole aspect of hunting, not about warfare. Athena also is virginal as a goddess, but she is about warfare. Artemis is about hunting, and she is the one then that is close to Apollo. Athena is always born individually, not through the womb of some woman, but from the mind thigh of Zeus himself. Apollo and the 9 muses together then make the Museion, the pivot of the immense library of Alexandria and all of the fortunes of the empire. The different kingdoms under Alexander the Great knew that this was the closest thing to Alexander, because he was after a vision. In Greek it's called the oikumene. In Latin it's pronounced ecumene. He was after the one family of man, the family of mankind. In the 1950s there was a popular photographic book called The Family of Man, and they put it out in paper editions so everybody could have a copy of it and understand this is an idea whose time always is coming. And what is happening now in the 21st century is that the idea has been perverted into a ideological form that is characteristic of the decay of time forms when they are left in cycles. If time in civilization is left in cycles, it will always decay to tragedy. Always. It's built in because it begins with the limitation that here is the beginning of a new age, of a golden age, and that beginning is a poisoned apple. As soon as you take a bite out of limiting time and civilization to a cycle of ages, and that a new age is going to make a difference, it is exactly that new age that will putrefy first. We've seen it in our own time. We've witnessed it in our own time. And it leaves a stinking mess, which is apparent everywhere, on every level. And there's no relief in sight. And so one has to shift from sight to vision. And this is what the book of Job was written for, to shift from seeing. The translation of the Torah was ordered by Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and he knew that Alexander had brought with him, even before Alexandria was marked out as going to be the new world city, the new city of the oikumene, of the family of man. Not about kingdoms, not about empires. It was about man as a species. And this was going to be it. He knew that it had to have capacities to reach out everywhere in the world. And so he brought with him, at that time, the only peoples that had 2,000 years of experience of what we today would call international trade. And that was the northern Semitic peoples. The northern Semitic peoples, under Sargon of Akkad, by about 2350 BC, had already set up a trading empire that used to be called, because it was originally called in Akkadian Sumerian, the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent went from the Persian Gulf all the way curving over to the Mediterranean Sea. And that Fertile Crescent was in shape, if you looked at it, like the Isis moon. It was the first indication that the moon in its cycle returns back from a dark moon and proceeds through its phases to a full moon. And though that full moon will become gibbous, the dark Isis moon begins with the dark shadow of the moon and increases until it is a dark moon. And if one can understand the lunar cycles as a triad, become a quaternary, become finally transformed by a pentacle, a 5-star way of looking. You go from dark of the moon all the way through the full moon gibbous to the old crescent to the dark of the moon again. But the fifth, the magical fifth, the renewal, not the renewal so much as in a cycle, but the re-entry again to the light that has always been there but not been apparent. It isn't that the moon was dark, it's that the sunlight was invisible. And that the Isis moon would appear again is not the beginning of a new cycle. It's the confirmation that the invisibility can resurface into visibility. And the vision to understand that is what makes civilization. Stand head, shoulders, ankles, and toes above culture. Brings the so-called supernatural into play in the natural so that it is a fertility fructifying transform, not just once but twice. It comes once through the crescent Isis. It comes twice through the full moon, which is, in ancient times, the way in which writing was first made discursive. Written language became discursive, and the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago said it was anciently true that the first person to be able to invent writing was Thoth, and that Thoth made the gift to mankind from the divine of a written language. And so one finds that in the triangle of Isis and Thoth, one begins to understand the place of Osiris. That Osiris, the god of resurrection, is triangulated because of Isis being able to encourage the weathering through the invisible, darkness seeming to the dawn of the light again, so that one understands it's not a new light, it's not a new moon. The new moon is the darkness. But it is the proof that there is a continuity of light that has never gone. It's that the light shineth, but the darkness knoweth it not. That's an ancient saying from St. John. We know today on the internet, just yesterday on Science Daily, the confirmation again of something that was done almost 100 years ago, actually a couple of 100 years ago. It reads, a landmark experiment on wave interference from the early 1800s is revisited using gold nanoparticles. In the 18th century, scientists faced a conundrum. Is light a wave or a particle? One of the strongest pieces of evidence to support the wave view, the landmark double-slit experiment reported in 1804 by the scientist Thomas Young. If you put two slits and introduce a light source so that those slits are so narrow, the light coming through those slits will make a wave form, and the two wave forms will begin to interfere with each other. So that light, yes, is a wave, but why, if you split the wave, would it produce an interference pattern? And only just now, in the spring of 2014, the experiment was done again on the nanoscale with gold particles. And with a single gold particle as the, quote, slit reproduction, light wave has its beautiful symmetry, and its waveforms are given here in diagram. It looks like an angelic spread of wings going dynamically forth. Whereas if there are two gold nanoparticles, even if they're overlapping, you get an interference pattern which is crippled. You don't get the angelic wings dynamically soaring at all. This has to do with high dharma. This has to do with the mind. That when the mind is open, you get the angelic wing pattern soaring. when the mind becomes opaque because of a backing, like putting silver to glass, now that portion of the glass becomes mirror. And the more mirror that it is, the more that there's an interference until you complete the glazing of the window. And then you have a complete mirror. And what the complete mirror shows is a reflection of yourself, a reflection of exactly what is seeable through that mirror, wherever it is facing, and that this is the whole basis of identification. This is the whole logical construct, taproot of the hubris and the stupidity, the ignorance and the demonicness of a person, a community, a civilization, a star system. A whole cluster of star system is some kind of interstellar empire, is led astray chronically, permanently. One cure is to break the mirror. But there's a better way, and that is to clarify, to scrape off, to dissolve off the backing so that one sees again. And then light has no interference pattern, and the waveform shows very clearly the symmetry of a winged corsedness of the spirit. It's unmistakable. The author of the classical book of Job understood that time forms have in civilization an esoteric quality because of his inheritance. And after the break, we'll come to that inheritance, which was extraordinary. And he wrote the book of Job to be the beacon of how this works. And the last book that he wrote the book of Job at about 25 years of age, about 210 BC, and 50 years later, about 160 BC, he wrote the book of Daniel. And in Alexandria, he was known as the prophet Daniel. And there's still today in Alexandria, 2014, a great boulevard that is left almost intact from antiquity, as few things are in Alexandria, and is still called, in Arabic, after the prophet Daniel. He is known to Jews, and then not known to rabbinical Jews at all, as the teacher of righteousness. He is the founder of the Qumran community. He is the author of the book of Job. He's the author of something that was shredded into fragments, the book of Noah. And he's the author of the book of Daniel in Alexandria, where it was preserved, just like the book of Job was preserved, because in Alexandria, the translation from Hebrew into Greek was the speciality of the way in which the ecumeny and the great library and the museum worked. And those translators, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, 72 translators, brought from Israel to Alexandria following the ecumeny plans that the Ptolemies well understood from Alexander the Great. You need to have the genius of the ancient North Semitic wisdom in order to understand the concourse beyond kingdoms, beyond empires. They were the first peoples who were able to understand everyone is included. This includes Africa, includes Asia, includes Europe. It includes new worlds that are there, that in ancient Alexandria, one of the geniuses of the library, one of the heads of consulting the Museum, where the 9 muses really were muses, they were women. In an Apollonian way. His name was Eratosthenes, who understood the way in which shadows relate to the sun, and was able, through complex experiments, to find that the circumference of the world was spherical, and that it was roughly 25,000 miles in circuit, in ambit. He came within a couple of hundreds of miles of the true size of the Earth 2,300 years ago. He was a very close friend of the daughter-in-law of Ptolemy Philadelphus. Her name was Berenice, and she became the Empress Berenice II because the original Ptolemy's wife was named Berenice. More after a break. Let's come back. One of the pillars beginning to sense that they're like goalposts. There's 2 pillars like the 2 pillars of the Kabbalah, which is a medieval make-up, mock-up that doesn't really get to it, etc., etc. The other that we're pairing like a tuning fork, because there's always a symmetrical pairedness to a set that can become a harmonic. It's what makes the universe a universe, and to be able to hear and then compose in the harmonic, making music, is what the cosmos is all about. As Pythagoras beautifully stated, said, wrote in Greek, the epithet is ipsa dixit, he said, Pythagoras, music of the spheres. There is such a thing as taking a string and putting your finger in the middle, and you get 2 out of 1. And you put 2 fingers on that string. As long as the string is limited, you can do this. Then you get 3. You can put 3, and then you get 4. So that in music, you can have a note, you can have a half note. You can have thirds, you can have fourths, you can have fifths, which is a very powerful composition. Beethoven's 5th Symphony in D major is very powerful. Da, 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 da. You can have 6th, 7th, all the way up to 10ths. And classical, Pythagorean, harmonic music. And you can do an analytic on its basis. Holds up. As Frank Lloyd Wright observed wisely, architecture is like frozen music. But you can build architecture dynamically so that when you walk in it, when you walk through it, it turns into music. If you go to his Marin County Civic Center, built after the maestro died at 92, approaching 93, the building looks kind of like old science fiction, 50s science fiction, until you walk through it. And the pace of walking, about 2 miles an hour, that building stretches its angelic wings dynamically, and the whole composition soars into play. In the tough, huge metropolis of Dallas, Texas, Big D, the Dallas Theater Center looks very peculiar from the outside, from photos of it, and when you stand in it, it's just very peculiar. Until you get the musical key, is that the angle of vision that is dynamic is 30 degrees. And as soon as you get 30 degrees and double it to 60 and triple it to 90, can you get the hermetic drift? The Dallas Theater Center, no longer the Kalita Theater Center, no longer the Dallas Theater Center, it's the Frank Lloyd Wright Theater Center that comes into play. And there you are. At the Gamble House in Pasadena, built for the Gambles of Procter & Gamble in 1902. Green and Green, the architects, sent the Gamble scions to Europe for a year or two so that they would not be interfered with, and then built the house. And the harmonic index is a visual cloud motif. It's a horizon that has a flattened bubble in the center, so that you have this cloud symbol from Japan that also is like a American invention of the cedar shake house, craft house, only on a very large scale. And you see that cloud motif everywhere. It's on the back of the dining chairs. It's on the tiles, handmade, of the fireplace. And when you go to the third story of what would be this enormous open boat-like attic, the center beam holding the entire house together is one massive cloud symbol. There's not a nail in the Green and Green Gamble house. It's all dovetailed, wedged, doweled, and it holds. And still, through all the earthquakes, it's in very, very good shape. You have to understand that what is being offered here doesn't need nails. We don't need to tack down arguments or make ideological soirees hoping that they're convincing. When I started out in electrical engineering at the University of Wisconsin, the very first thing that we were told, incoming freshmen by Dean Shields, most of us were male, so he addressed us as, boys, in science you can work with theory, but in engineering you have to work with practice. You have to be able to build so it works, so it stands. And for this, the first purchase you're going to make is to go down to the engineering school bookstore, which is separate from the university bookstore. And you're going to buy a slide rule and a leather holster to put it in. And you're going to strap that on to your belt as if you were gunfighters, because you're going to learn the practice of building for real. And that's how I began at 17. The answer to Job is tunable and parable in the work being presented even now, some almost 60 years later. The book of Job is a Greek tragedy. Now, the author, Horace M. Callan, was a character He lived to be 92. He just died in 1974. He was born in 1882 in a part of Eastern Europe that was then called Silesia. And his father, Jacob David Callan, was the Orthodox rabbi, very famous in Silesia, and his wife, Rebecca. And they were extremely learned and capable. And they decided that in 1887 they were going to move. They were doing very well, but they wanted to come to America. So they came, and young Horace, 5 years old, being given a learning home environment, Orthodox rabbi and his Rebecca wife, seeing to the fact that their firstborn son getting the best education you can get, and he eventually went to Harvard. And his introduction to Harvard in philosophy, that's what he wanted to be in. Yeah, I'd like to study philosophy, was George Santayana. And Santayana, of Spanish and English descent, was one of the most beautifully erudite philosophers of all time. His writing, his classic book is called The Sense of Beauty, still in print to all this time. Callan learned to be elegant and to understand that a elegant structure that doesn't just stand there like an ideological construct of whatever ilk or sort has to be load-bearing, in that, like a bridge, it will take the load. It will work. And he understood that of all the forms philosophically of literature, that is the most dynamic is a poetic put into a dialogue, which is then a drama. And it is the dramatic play of the poetic in character that makes the play, and when it's done right, is magical. The grand night for singing. I feel like falling in love. That quality reached an apex in antiquity with Greek tragedy, which was a high poetic based upon a dance form of the Greek mysteries. In Greek, it's called chorea. In a chorea, one moves around this way and then pivots and then moves back around the other way. It's a double chiral with a pause in between, and then coming back, one has a stand. One has the presentation that you have done both sweeps together in a symmetry with the breath in between. Just like the word for Jesus in the Zohar is 4 Hebrew letters with an aspirant pause in between those two pairs. And that's how it's pronounced esoterically in the Zohar, the Book of Splendor. Because someone knew this wasn't just a name. It is important to see that Greek tragedy was never a genre in Hebrew. Never. Never used. The only time that one has a dialogue in the Old Testament, other than the book of Job, is in the Song of Solomon. And it's not by Solomon. Proverbs is by Solomon. And you have Solomon's own writing style. You can read it. It's beautiful. It's fine. He says, when I was young, I was fortunate. I took wisdom as my feminine instructor, guide. The wisdom of Solomon is female. The author of the Song of Songs is female. She's an African female. Her name was Makeda. Makeda. And Makeda was the Queen of Sheba. And the Song of Songs has an antiphonal voicing where Solomon's words of wisdom are brought by the feminine living wisdom, Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, into an interplay with hers. And so you have the Song of Songs. It's an exponential transform. The book of Job is a hermetic distillation of that transform. When he was born, about the third generation of those translators that came to Alexandria from Israel, those 6 masters of Hebrew, and at the same time, every one of the 72 was a master of Greek. How does this happen? How does this happen in Israel? Because the development of Hebrew as a written language reaching a poetic has its original literature. Everyone still reads it in translation. It's called the Psalms of David. And the Psalms of David is the first time that Hebrew as a language begins to have a kind of a viability of a very, very high poetic. The written Hebrew that is there from Moses has its qualities, but its qualities are a linking forthrightness. This begets this, and this begat that, and so forth. And you get the linkage of how all of this comes together as like a grand epic, a historia of epic proportions. From Adam through the development of the patriarchs with Abraham as the pivot, through the descendants to Joseph in Egypt, who becomes the master of Egypt under only the Pharaoh, the second most powerful man in that part of the world at the time, whose wife, his wife was the daughter of the sister of the 12 brothers for whom the 12 tribes were portioned. Their sister was named Dinah. And Dinah, after she was saved from her rapes, and her rapists were killed by her brothers, they sent her to Egypt in a very covered, protective way. And there Dinah became the wife of the head priest of Heliopolis. And their daughter was Asenath, and she was the wife of Joseph of Egypt. And they had 2 sons. And those 2 sons took the place of the tribe that had originally been the tribe of Joseph. And one of the tribes had been excerpted as special, the tribe of Levi, so that the Josephites became a pair, and the Levites, the mysterious tribe that was then esoterically like a 13th tribe, and the sons of Joseph and Asenath became tribe-holding, land-holding, tradition-holding, patriarchal-holding members. If you don't know this, you can be as orthodox as you want and not know, and not be farther into, beyond the truth of knowing, into the high Dharma, beyond knowing, and that is of visioning, so that the light is dynamically perfect, pure. Then you can really see. You can see knowing for the good thing that it is, but you can see seeing as the excellent unlimitedness that it is real. You can move from complete, that is good, to perfection, that is real. That's what's going on, folks. The book of Job is a Greek tragedy, is the third generation, the grandson generation of the translators that made the Greek Bible. Then in Greek is called the Septuagint, meaning the 70. Yeah, they truncated the 72 to 70. The Septuagint. It's still in print. A new translation into English has just been made. Oxford University Press. The old translation, which I've had a copy for at least half a century, is still good. It's fine. The new one is like refined. Of course they're expensive. So that the author of the book of Job inherited the Alexandrian Hellenistic Judaism cosmic scope and saw that one could reach back into the origins 1,000 years before David. What happened 1,000 years before David is the time of Abraham. Reaching all the way back to the time of Abraham, born about 2000 BC, had his vision at 75 of the Promised Land, and at 75 took his wife Sarai. She didn't become Sarah until she was pregnant and gave birth to Isaac. Then she became Sarah. And he took his cousin, and they took all of their flocks and all of their fellow Jews, and they went to the Promised Land. It wasn't a Promised Land that they conquered by sword. Abraham was very, very vision clear. He got permission to have his flocks, but the first place that he bought was a cave in the high city called Hebron. And that cave is named the Cave of Machpelah. And he said at the time to an assembled group of people, leaders, look, leadership, he said, I'm an old man. I have a lot of experience. I can see seeing clearly. I want to pay for this cave. And so the Cave of Machpelah is the first time that the Promised Land became physical, geophysical. And that cave has an architectural structure that is still there almost 4,000 years later in Hebron. You can go there. The graves of Abraham and Sarah are there. The graves of Isaac and Rebekah are there. The wife of Jacob, Rachel, was not possible because of conditions to put her in the cave of Machpelah, and so she was buried at the crossroads coming out of Jerusalem just before it went into Bethlehem, and that's where she was buried, Rebekah's well. And Jacob, likewise, could not be buried there. He's buried at the original spring in what traditionally was Samaria. And Jacob's well was the place that Abraham originally had the watering of his herds, and Isaac's watering of their herds, and so forth. And so Jacob was placed there so that Jacob is under Mount Gerizim. So that when it came time for a very powerful, original prophet to be born and raised, that prophet's name was Samuel. And Samuel was born and raised on Mount Gerizim on its slopes all the way down to Jacob's well. That's the well where Jesus, centuries and centuries later, while all the disciples were going to get food, he asked a woman coming to the well for water, for a drink, that she was pulling up water from the well, and she gave to him. And that was the parable of the Good Samaritan, because he understood, because he could see beyond seeing itself, into visioning beyond history into the real. This is not a level. This is not an argument. It's not an idea. I'm an old, trained, ancient engineer. If it doesn't work, if it doesn't stand, the architecture I can vision is not going to be an art that will work. When I first began this in the early 1980s, I had no idea, which was great, but used the ancient architectural based on engineering. Frank Lloyd Wright was an architect who was an engineer at the University of Wisconsin, just like me. You take what you know works and you develop from that. And then you use that as an investigative survey, and you do your survey. As Wright said, if a building is built right, you can't imagine it anywhere but where it is. It grew out of the site. And the site is whatever it really is. It's important that Callan is the first to be able to understand, as the favored son of an Orthodox rabbi, recently become American. One of the teachers that was there at Harvard was a lifelong friend of Callan's. His name was Alain Locke, Alainlocke, whom was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar. This was back in the 19th century. The next time there was an African-American Rhodes Scholar was 1960. Are you hearing this? It is the Queen of Sheba. It is the African-American Rhodes Scholar. later on that encouraged Callan to understand how can a scriptural Jewish Bible, Old Testament book be a Greek tragedy. There are no tragedies. Tragedy is a high Dharma form made by Aeschylus, because Aeschylus was very close friends. His lifelong buddy was Pindar. And Pindar is the great lyric poet of classical literature. Pindar is head, shoulders, wings, and winged ankles above everybody else. When somebody did a translation of Pindar back in the 1950s, great English Cambridge Don C.M. Bora wrote a review of it and said, "This will not do. Pindar is like an eagle. You don't leash an eagle and then take it for short little walks." Pindar, his Greek is all about athletes, but it's about the dynamic of athletes going beyond what is possible. No one can do that. This man did it. No one can come hobbling to the plate in a World Series baseball game, cannot even stand still, like Kirk Gibson hitting that home run off Dennis Eckersley, who's a Hall of Fame relief pitcher. No one can do that. Gibson did it. Vin Scully, everyone can still hear it. The impossible has happened. It is not possible. It has never happened. It's never happened before or since. It can't happen. It happened. The book of Job is a Greek tragedy, was finally pieced together by Horace Callan and published in 1918. It's the first edition. Just as World War I was ending, Horace Callan brought his courage to be with those who had fallen in places like Flanders Fields or in the Battle of the Somme, where the long trench, like an open festering scar across Europe, took 1.5 million lives in a few months. All those young men on both sides of a great earthquake trench that showed that European history was not only fractured, it was like a San Andreas fault. It's going to be subject to earthquakes without end, more and more severe. You are going to have a nuclear war. Absolutely for sure. Bertrand Russell, who lived to be 97, said, "Man has never made a weapon that he hasn't used." One has to revision the world and revision mankind as a species. And the book of Job is the initial way in which that happens. The fragmented, dispersed book of Noah, there's a few fragments that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, one of the few Targums found complete in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Targum of Job. What is a Targum? A Targum is a translating of the Hebrew of the writing, the scripture, into Aramaic. It's like a very heavily inflected dialect of Hebrew. A less deflected dialect current with Aramaic was Syriac. And Syriac was a dialect of Greek, which is related to Hebrew because they both became discursive languages at the same time. The beginnings of what turned out to be Greek was Linear A, which was contemporaneous with the way in which the North Semitic alphabet was first made in letters that became Hebrew, and first made in ways that Linear A, later on through Linear B, became recognizable as Greek, as classical Greek. So that Greek and Hebrew, by the time they get to Alexandria, on the level of Ptolemy II Philadelphus and his wife Arsinoe. There's a new biography of Arsinoe because it's for the first time that anybody is paying attention to them. Just published. And the same publisher, Oxford University Press, a biography of Berenice II. It is the first time ever that anyone has taken the engineering architectural care to understand that the women are not disposable. They're not dispensable. If you don't know about the Queen of Sheba, you can't possibly know about Solomon. And if you don't know that, you don't know that the Ark of Covenant was taken by the son of Solomon, who was at the same time the son of the Queen of Sheba. Makeda's son was named Menelik. And when he was 21, he went to see his father for the first time. And Solomon, by that time, had become sort of desolate. Too many women, too much money, too much triumph. One can get bloated and forget that wisdom is real in that person. When you don't keep with that person, then the interference waves come into play. And you become fractured, like a kind of Dutch ceramic that is built on fractures. Or you become piecemeal like the Byzantine mosaics. And pretty soon you try to do abstract art in mosaics, and you try to do it really fancy to keep them floating, and what you end up with is a blizzard of confusion. And you say, well, it must be beautiful. More next week.